So I want to welcome everybody to the first episode of the Sports Performance Professional Podcast. And this is where we bring the facts to issues that are pressing in the sports performance industry. And so to tell you a little bit about the podcast, so what we do is we have a format where each of us, me and my co-host, will have 25 minutes per person to talk about a particular topic that we're focusing on for that particular podcast. And so we can divvy this up based on how we respond, whether we're starting a topic or whether we're actually moving the discussion in a new direction. And so I wanted to show you really quick how to get to our landing page for you to sign up for the emailing list to receive some of our exclusive content that will be coming out. And so you want to go to Athletic Holistic Systems, and that's holistic with an H.com, and you'll click the tab in the right, as I'm doing here, as I'm showing you. You'll click the podcast tab, and it'll take you right to our landing page. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can type in your first name, last name, and then you'll press the join button, and you'll get an email confirmation saying that you have successfully joined our emailing list. So as I take you off of here, and so just to introduce myself briefly, so my name's Tim Smith, and I was raised and grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. And so I've been a strength and conditioning coach for the past 6 years at the university level. And currently I'm a strength and conditioning coach. Currently I'm a PhD student at MTSU in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And my area of focus is sport pedagogy. And so I'm just diving into areas of trying to make the sports performance industry, or in this case, strength and conditioning, trying to find better ways to educate coaches and then find predictive metrics to be able to universally evaluate some type of standard for evaluating coaches and developing coaches in the United States. And so I'm gonna go ahead and flip it over to my teammate, my partner in crime on this show, Coach Edelman.
What's up, everybody? So my name is Coach Henry Edelman. Tim, I appreciate the introduction, man. I've known Tim for a few years now. I was born in California. Tim and I met when I was doing my graduate assistant position over at the Fresno State University. He was working with the University of Washington baseball team. And, you know, as coaches do, he came by the facilities when they came and visited. We met a little bit. He's a really good, smart dude. And I'm excited to do this podcast with him. Right now, myself, I'm a part-time strength conditioning coach at the University of Tennessee, working mainly with the football program. And then I'm also doing a part-time personal training gig at D1 Hardin Valley. Shout out to D1 Hardin Valley. Love those people, love my clients and everything. And yeah, like I said, I'm excited to get this thing going with Tim.
Now, sounds good. And so I'll go ahead and introduce the topic. And let me pull up, stop screen sharing. And so the topic, or the article that we'll be reviewing today, and so actually just to take a quick step back, and so each podcast that we do, we'll we'll talk about a particular piece of content. That could be an article, a social media post, it could also be a research paper, etc. And so we'll literally deep dive, and we'll go into the article section by section, line by line, and we'll go particularly back and forth on what we think about it, some practical solutions, kind of forecasting, how the impact of this will have in the future. And again, same thing as, me kind of going back and bringing up some historical context to see, with these issues, what has happened in the past in other fields, and is this something that's actually, a repeated cycle just within strength and conditioning, et cetera. And so the article that we'll be reviewing today and doing a deep dive in is called "Should Strength and Conditioning Coaches Unionize Now?" And it was an article published on simplyfaster.com if you want to go over there and check it out. And I don't want to butcher the guy's name who made the article, but we'll just refer to him as Flat, so by his last name. And if you want to go to his social media, I have it here on the screen, and it's called @Rugby Strength Coach, so RUGBY_STR_coach, COACH. If you do want to go and look at his content and look at the article and just see, what he's about in this case. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and start us off with the discussion and diving into the first section of the article titled, Times Have Changed. And so he brings up an interesting point about income inequality. And so he mentioned feudalism as a reference to, let's say, in historical reference to, let's say, the effects of capitalism and how capitalism may actually be creating this wealth gap and also this income gap. So I provided a resource for you that I'll use as I kind of progress through my talk. And so the picture that I wanted to kind of create that kind of shows this aspect, and actually let me pull it up a little bit. You can... no, I don't see it going up. But anyway, so what I want to kind of create with this picture here is that you see this pyramid. And so if we look at it and try to relate it over to, let's say, strength and conditioning and the athletic department, based on what he's trying to paint in this notion is that, let's say, the athletic director's at the top of that pyramid, and then you have your sport coaches, as you move down, and then let's say the strength coaches would be at the bottom of that pyramid. And that's just denoting what the income gap between, and he used the notion of like the CEO to, let's say, the lowest paid workers, like a 221-to-1 ratio. And so I just wanted to show this picture here to try to create some type of visual for you to understand that, okay, we're saying that the athletic directors are disproportionately making more money based on the revenue than, let's say, the strength coaches at the bottom, who also are not being able to get that because, hey, there's an invisible hand in their pocket. And so moving forward, I have this next slide that's pulling up. And so I circled or aligned 3 aspects about the 9 myths. And this is the resource that or the reference I put in the previous page about, what are some of the preconceived assumptions about the effect of capitalism and how it's affecting, let's say, our industry and strength and conditioning coaches specifically. And so the 3 that I outlined is capitalism truly creating this income gap between, let's say, athletic directors and your sport coaches and your strength and conditioning coaches, or is there some other factors that's governing why the income discrepancy is where it is? There's also the corporations earn obscene profits at the expense of consumers and workers. So in this case, the university, the athletic department, the money that it generates from those revenue sports, or let's say just from the Olympic sports side, is that creating a dynamic that's creating, let's say, this income inequality discrepancy. And so I'll look at that a little bit closer as well. And then the last one, number 8, without government protection of labor unions, workers would not obtain a fair wage. And so this is another notion that he brings up in the title of the article, should strength coaches unionize in order to try to not necessarily make their wages more competitive, but in order to secure a more sustainable living wage, or just a minimum wage in that case, as he talked about some financial barriers into the field. So as I move forward to discuss the next slide, and so he discusses that, and again, I'm just using this for historical context to kind of drive the discussion, to kind of give you that background first before I really dive into, and same thing with Coach Edelman. And so he brings up the Industrial Revolution, and he talks about that the Industrial Revolution basically created this area of specialization and also division of labor. And so specialization just meaning that, hey, people can actually focus on particular skill sets and use that to increase their productivity. And that's in the same thing with the division of labor. And so now if you have a bunch of people with this particular skill set, they can now, as a group, then create, let's say, an industry, and they also can sell their services to a particular set of consumers. And so he also brings up technological development, and I'll talk about this later on in my presentation, or just on one of the points I'll talk about, is that interestingly enough, technology has a tremendous effect on the type of skills that are needed, and creates a tremendous amount of income inequality as well, because technology always is biased towards a particular skill set. And in this case, we live in, let's say, the third industrial revolution. That's more in regards to information technology. And in strength and conditioning, this has, in my opinion, a tremendous amount of impact, because now, there's a need for data analysis, there's a need for research, there's a need for individuals who have abilities to, let's say, use and interact with technologies that can capture biometric data. And so he mentions, and I have it underlined here, that this was the first time, the Industrial Revolution was the first time that individuals were able to hoard huge sums of wealth. And he talked about monopolizing that wealth. And he also talking about the increase in income inequality was 100-fold during that period. And so, like I said, I'll talk about a little bit more about that in depth as I move forward. But some critical aspects that may actually speak to why that was created was because of this notion of division of labor that was dictated by technological development or technological progress that allowed, one, this rapid improvement of industries. And in this case, he mentioned Henry Ford, and capitalism was one reason why that was happening in a free market, laissez-faire market structure. So I'll actually end my notion right here, and I'll let Coach Edelman respond or start off with a point that he wants to go with.
Appreciate that, Tim. So yeah, Tim, I mean, he was breaking down the whole background of the article right there. Flat, when he starts off, he begins to talk about how he gives us a brief history. He gives us a brief history of labor laws and workers' comp, and how those types of things came to be, and the abuse of power that these huge monopolized industries used to have over our workers. So again, talks about the Industrial Revolution. He talks about these huge companies, and basically they just had the notion of, people are working hard and they wanted fairer wages. They wanted better working conditions, right? And essentially these big organizations, these big companies that a lot of people were in line to work for, just said like, oh, you don't like it? Oh, you don't want to do this? Then we got, 20 other people that will, right? And so Flat kind of parallels that and brings it to today. And one thing he talks about is unregulated, near exploitative work hours, flat or worsening pay, a hugely oversupplied workforce that is easy to fire and replace, and huge income disparity between those at the top and the bottom. Coaches, does that sound familiar? Right? And so you take a step back and you go, okay, unionizing was very important for these workers of old who were trying to support their families, right? And needed these jobs and wanted to work for these big, big, well-known organizations. First off, just to kind of support their families, but second off, they wanted to work for the main name. They wanted to work for a company that was highly sought out, right? And they talk about, how because they were such highly sought out jobs, because they were big name corporations, that they were able to kind of kick people to the curb. And these people ended up in a lot of messed up, bad situations due to that, right? And one thing I want to talk about when relating this to strength conditioning, one of my immediate thoughts is strength conditioning, jobs in sports, jobs working with teams, especially high level, collegiate programs. Tim has worked at some of the highest level of collegiate baseball. I'm now working at some of the highest level of collegiate football. These are sought out jobs. You know what I mean? And so when we talk about unionizing, right, and kind of coming up with a way to make workers' comp and worker laws more fair, one thing that I think of, and no disrespect to people that work in the union now, I got a lot of good people that I know that work in the union now, but those jobs aren't as highly sought out as a strength conditioning coach's position might be. Everyone wants to work in sports, whether they know what that takes or know what that entails. That's a different story. But people want to be affiliated with the big name. They want to be affiliated with the professional teams. They want to be affiliated with the higher level Power 5 conference schools, whether it's, baseball, basketball, football. Those are kind of your upper echelon sports, right? And so it's tough to argue, or it's tough to say, hey, we should unionize, when in reality, the union really occurred, or unionizing really was a thing, because these are kind of your day-to-day responsibilities, your electricians, your plumbers, your labor workers, right? Who aren't in these jobs because they wanted that to be their careers their whole lives necessarily. The union people that I know, right? And this might be a generalization, right? But the union people I know that work in the union now, again, all great people, all very hardworking, they understand that there are already bylaws set in place so they don't get screwed over. And so they want a job like that so they can enter into what they know is going to be a fair opportunity, right? They want to go into a job that will always require somebody to work that job. We always need electricians. We always need people working at houses. We always need people working those union type jobs. So there's a certain amount of security there when you go into a position like that, even if it's not something that you necessarily wanted to do or something that you grew up dreaming about doing since you were young and stuff like that. Whereas being a coach or being in a professional organization or a high major collegiate organization, those are highly sought out jobs, right? And so for me, it's tough in that regard to say, we want to take these collegiate positions, whether mid-major or upper level, and make them into a union spot or a union job, because these are jobs that people want. These are jobs that people are chomping at the bit to get into. Unlike, again, no offense, no disrespect to some of my union workers, some of the best workers, some of the hardest workers I know, but working in athletics is just a little more, it's a little more sought out. It's a little more, there's more bells and whistles and kind of glamour and gravitas to a responsibility in the job field that entails, right? So, I mean, it's tough when we talk about unionizing in relation to sports or in relation to strength conditioning, just because when I think union jobs, I think of jobs that were being they were taking advantage of their employees, right? But these are also jobs that people were like, you know what, like, I don't, I could do something different with my life. I could do something different with my life, right? But they wanted that comfortability, and they rose to, they came together and they rose up. It was the many against the few. It was the poor against the rich. It's a story as old as time, right? But, when you take a step back and you parallel that with the field that we're in as a coach, as a sport performance coach, it'd be tough to say like, hey guys, we need to band together and make this more fair for ourselves, because ultimately, again, these are highly sought after jobs, right? And if you come and you come to your superiors, they might kick you to the curb just as quickly for trying to unionize, right? And I think that's a big fear. I don't know, Tim, what do you think about all that, man?
Yeah, so you make again a lot of good points about the context of where unions have thrived, and so I actually bring up later on a couple of examples with, let's say, the unionization of the coal mine industry during I think the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, maybe a little above that. And so they were able to secure higher wages, but they end up killing the coal industry because the market reacted we can say in a positive way, because oil then became, it switched from coal to oil. And so it shifted and generated a high amount of unemployment. And so, as you kind of alluding to here, is that, based on, let's say, a commodity-based business in the sense of coal or oil, and also have an example. It happened in the metal industry and the steel industry as well. That they went on strike, not strike, but they unionized, and they tried to secure higher minimum wages, and they did, but they end up killing their own industry. And they end up generating a high amount of unemployment. And so it's tough to say if, labor unions is the way to go, especially in our field where, again, and I kind of go into the oversaturation as I move forward. Now I'll pull up my next point. But I agree that, I'm not sure, historically speaking, if that's the best move. And again, with the oversaturation issue in the case of strength and conditioning, where non-athletes want the jobs just as much as athletes want, let's say, these strength and conditioning spots, and even, other aspects in the organization. And so that's another interesting aspect to bring up, because it kind of alludes to this parallel between the increases or the new technological innovations. So in this case, new skill sets are now being highly sought after. And we now know that, let's say, these opportunities for people on the outside of sports, let's say, who had nothing to do with, so it doesn't mean they weren't athletes at one point, but let's just say that I'm not saying that they be taking these jobs for vanity, et cetera. But I'm just saying it has now created more of a competitive environment where now people who are not associated with sports, let's say a mechanical engineer, or let's say a software engineer, let's say someone who has experience or who has skills in coding. I mean, now with all this data that's being produced in sports, well, that becomes a skill set, and so that those particular need in the industry, in the market, with all this data being able to be grabbed, well, there's a need for people who can utilize this data and those skill sets. The market will bias towards those skill sets. And so that's why we even see it with the NSCA developing their new certification for sports science. So, a lot of the field is shifting away from, being able, or I'll say the knowledge, skills, and abilities for strength coaches are beginning to, shift to a new paradigm where, if you're not able to, let's say, capture data with some type of tech, or if you're not affluent in using the tech, so K-Vest, or whether you're using 4D motion or capturing biomechanical data using GPS, et cetera, which is really the norm in football right now from my standpoint. But if you don't have that skill set, that's obviously going to set you on the outside kind of looking in as far as being able to be competitive in the type of market that we live in now. So let me pull up my next slide here. And so what I wanted to show with this slide, actually, let me make this completely full, as you can see. All right, so what I wanted to show this and kind of continue to just paint that picture of, what the income inequality has looked like internationally and just nationally. And again, this is not an economic discussion in the sense of, okay, we're going to spend a tremendous amount of time, but it's really more so to just paint that picture and paint that context for us as we kind of narrow the scope and really focus this in on strength and conditioning. And so what I wanted to show here was that as we can kind of see the total income that was going to, let's say, the top 1%, so in this case, the wealthy, the rich, for the United States, so in English-speaking countries, and this is on the left side of the graph, it's more of a U shape. So it began to trend down prior to after World War II. And then around the 70s and 80s, it was at the lowest of that peak, and it began to rise again as we approached 2014. So the share of the amount of income that was going to, let's say, the wealthy, the rich, and the top 1% was actually on a decline prior to. So it's kind of creating context on, what was happening politically, as I mentioned in number one, that political forces tend to influence the income equality discrepancy. So that would be, government regulation, policies, law changes, et cetera. And it may not actually just be something happening strictly with the rich having their hands in our pockets from that case. And then I also wanted to show on the right hand side, this is Japan and different countries internationally. And you see it's more of an L shape where it was peaked around that World War II mark. And so it's steadily continued to go down. And even though it's flatlined a little bit and risen slightly, it still hasn't gotten back up to the level that it was previously, but that's a difference in English speaking countries. And so I just wanted to show here that political forces influence income inequality. There's also a trend that, global market forces and technological process, which I'm getting back to, kind of hitting that point over the head, influences this income inequality because, technology is biased towards particular skill sets. Then lastly, again, political framework will play a role. So again, policies, government regulation, et cetera. So I'll move forward. And this same thing is just showing the same discrepancy that the middle class and let's say the poor middle class, they were actually seeing higher changes in income in the 1980s, and that steadily trended downward. And for the 1%, the 99th percentile, it continued to grow at an exceptional rate that actually outpaced the middle and lower class. And now, again, they're seeking the highest income differences, in this case, positively speaking, currently in 2020 as we move forward. And so I wanted to show this slide because it creates, again, the context that technology really creates this big gap in income inequality, or I'll say that it can create this fluctuation between, what the skill sets were needed for strength and conditioning, let's say 10, 15 years ago, and what are the needs now based on everything that's changed in the market and based on this technological progress. And so if you look at the graph, the line that has the circles would be the college wage premium. And what the college wage premium is that's the amount of money that a college graduate is making versus a high school graduate. And then the triangle, which is the relative supply of college skills, shows that this is how many college graduates with a particular skill set are in the market. And so you see that the amount of money that college students were making or college graduates were making was actually increasing past the actual supply of college graduates who had, let's say, a particular skill. And so this was actually during the time of the second industrial revolution. So in this case, when computers were instituted in the workforce. So in this case, computers being on the job now as a skill that you need created a bias towards unskilled workers. And in this case, let's say high school graduates who didn't have any computer skills in the sense of working with computers. There was a bias. So you see the income inequality can happen. So this is the only thing that I wanted to show with this graph was that again, skills tend to be biased by response to the market, political forces, and again, to technological progress. And we're in a rapid progress in this case as well. And so I also want to touch on briefly, and he mentions, and Coach Edelman actually goes into this quite a bit, is that basically the bottom in this case, let's say strength coaches and just in general, where unions have been created, they're suffering disproportionately in wages, in hours worked. And then, it's just exploitative practices. And so I want to kind of create, again, and I'm looking at this from both sides because I've been there and done that. And I'm going through the process of being an intern and having to work for free. And I've only been able to make that happen by, living with one of my friends that I played baseball with in college and being able to make that a reality. And same thing when I was a GA. As well, I had to just, break the bank in order to make these things happen. And at that point, it was just something that I had to do. And so what I want to create is that, is capitalism is the way that the market is set up, is that's what's really causing, strength coaches to not being able to get a bigger piece of that pie. And also, talking about this notion of, there's no benefits, the poor working conditions. And again, I know it's a discrepancy between, let's say, if you're talking about the NAIA level, JUCO, really depends on level, et cetera, but just creating more clarity and awareness around those. And he didn't necessarily mention, because he said that he used the example that the 40-hour weeks is a joke. And again, obviously, in the sense that, and obviously in the sense that, I mean, come on, we do know for a fact that, again, that's just not the case, especially in season when you're traveling full time and stuff is ramping up, et cetera, at its peak. But like I said, I'll let Coach Edelman, jump back in and throw his 2 cents back in there. But my last aspect is that, is the income mobility, excuse me, I want to set the plate for what I'll talk about kind of going forward is that, is the strength coach restricted to a set amount of income? So is there no income mobility based on experiences and gaining new skills? And so if the answer is no, then again, we have really nothing to talk about. And of course, everything he's saying, then we need to find a way in order to, to fight for higher wages. But the answer is yes, then I'll present, more material on how is that possible, and is the situation that we're currently in more of a response to where the market is going, in the sense of what type of skill makes you more competitive to get those wages, to get what we're talking about we can get through a labor union without actually having to unionize.
Yeah, man. I think the biggest thing, Tim, and you touched on it quite a bit, especially at the beginning there, is like the wage gap, right? And so you got, especially with your higher sports, your footballs and your basketballs, whether that's professionally or at the NCAA level. Tim and I have mainly worked at the NCAA, the collegiate level, so we'll be referencing that more so than anything, especially when it comes to the strength coach side of things. But you have these $1 million head coaches, and then you have, again, like what was it? It was 100 to 1 or 200 to 1 or something like that was kind of the wage gap, like on Wall Street and back.
Yeah, he said 220 to 1.
Right. So I mean, like there is a way, without fighting for our rights as strength coaches and banding together and, kind of going on strike or whatever that would look like. There is a way to kind of break down your organization so that, more people are just getting kind of smaller pieces of that pie, as opposed to, your head guy getting the biggest piece of the pie by far, and then having interns and unpaid workers go hungry, right? With no pie, without even the crumbs, Tim, you know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
my thing is, I think there's a way to restructure, not necessarily unionize, but restructure from within these organizations. And obviously this is much easier said than done. Obviously this is way different from, your D3 all the way up to your high major D1s, right? But one thing I want to talk about, what Flat says, and this is a direct quote from the article, is we see again and again that winning organizations are filled with people who love to work there and whose core members often remain in place for years before success arrives. Winning organizations don't change the seats on the bus every 12 to 24 months. Well, people, when your head coach is driving the thing, right? Or your AD, or whoever we want to kind of refer to in this case, right? Maybe you got your AD driving, your head coach is back there directing him, telling him where to go and things like that, right? And then you got people who didn't even get on the bus and they got to walk to the spot. You know what I mean? So it's tough because you have people in these situations who want to they want a piece of the pie. They want to be on the bus, whatever analogy you want to use. And they actually are being invited to do so. Like, hey, come work for us for free. And, basically we'll take all your hard work and tell somebody else about how hard you worked and get you into another position. Or less likely, but also happens, is these people kind of come in, they're not getting any pie, they're not on the bus, right? But they kind of work their way up into getting a slice, a really, really small slice, but they work their way into getting a slice, and then they can get a bigger piece of the pie the longer that they're kind of around, right? And so one thing I wanted to talk about, and this is from my guy, Byron Jerido, who I worked with at Tennessee. He's now at South Carolina with their football program. He's a South Carolina alum. Really happy for him that he's out there and doing his thing in his hometown state. But one thing that he brought up, right, is traditionally on a football staff in the NCAA, you have five dudes. You have 5 full-time staff workers. You have your head guy, who's usually like a director, and then you have your assistant director, and then you have like an associate director. The titles, it's a bunch of BS. They're all over the place with, titles and labels and things like that. But anyway, so my guy, Coach B, basically said, well, instead of 5, why don't I take like 3 or 4, right? And then my interns, GAs, part-time coaches, they can be all kind of under the umbrella of the pay wage for like that 4th or 5th guy, right? So let's say there's like 250 to be spread around to everybody on staff. Okay, head man gets 150, next guy gets like 75 to 85, next guy gets, about the same. And then the people under that, right, you have like 3 people then splitting like an $80,000 or a $75,000 thing, right? And so for 3 part-time workers to get 20 to 25,000, I mean, that's not bad, and that's much better than what you'd see nowadays. Sometimes even for people that are considered full-time, right? So, I mean, again, it's tough to me to use that exact example just because, we're talking about an SEC school that has a lot of resources, right? Whether that's Tennessee or South Carolina, where my guy Coach B's at now, okay? And we're talking about areas of the country that are very affordable to live in, such as Tennessee, South Carolina, really most places in the South, right? So that being said, that is a viable example, a viable thought that coaches have kind of come together, coaches that aren't necessarily full-time, but coaches that have been at the bottom, made their way through the mud up to the top, right? And they kind of understand like, hey, this is, sorry, I was about to cuss right there, but this is BS. You know what I mean? This is, we got these kids coming in from college, as unpaid interns or graduate assistants, working their butts off, not getting nearly what they deserve, right? Like, why don't I take away that 5th person, right? And just have my 3 to 4 interns kind of split that amongst themselves so they don't have to go to their support system. So they don't have to go to their family. So they don't have to go to their grandparents or friends or whatever, wherever people are kind of getting their support from, So for me, when I was starting out, like it was my mom and dad kind of helping me here and there until I worked my way up into that paid role, right? And it's tough too, because in that regard, right, kind of taking this in a different direction, it makes it so, and again, this is something that Flat talks about, and this is a direct quote from the article, our field is missing out on the talents of potentially huge numbers of bright, hardworking, but poor coaches who simply can't afford to enter the workforce. An organized movement of coaches can work with the governing bodies and the institutions to lower the financial barriers of entry. The creation of a parallel career path, such as a nationally recognized paid apprenticeship, would be one option, would be a viable option, right? So unionizing could be the answer, right? But it's hard for me and Tim and the dude over at Maryville College, and then the dude over at some other school in Tennessee, right? It's tough for us to all get together and kind of come up with a game plan, right? So I think what it really boils down to is we need to change, not kind of externally, but internally, right? There needs to be a change from within, okay? And I mean, again, that could be something as simple as what my guy Coach B is talking about, and kind of restructuring your staff and restructuring the where the money to these staff members would go. You know what I mean? And so, and again, just kind of touching on the socioeconomic aspect of that, like you do, and I've worked with, and I'm sure you have too, Tim, worked with good dudes, good coaches, men and women that deserve a place at the table, deserve to have, a little bit of more money and a little more respect to their name because they're working their butts off and they're good coaches, right? And again, socioeconomically, that's going to come back to a bunch of different things too, as far as who kind of fits traditionally and research-based speaking into those socioeconomic pockets, right? So are we taking away some of our minority coaches, especially off the jump from some of these positions, by not creating paid positions? You know what I mean? I could go way further into that, I'm gonna get off my soapbox for a little bit though, Tim. I know you got a lot to say. And feel free to go off that. But yeah, man, I mean, I really think that, unionizing could be a great answer, but it is very hard to do. It is very hard for us to get together and really decide what is best. And people are going to have different opinions across the spectrum about what is best for who, right? And so I really think the internal processes, the internal makeups and infrastructures of these organizations and programs are going to be where you get or you can elicit the most change, right? And that's going to be someone standing up for you too. That's going to be, because if you go as a low-level worker to your higher up and you start saying like, hey, I think things need to be more adjusted, I think things aren't quite fair, then you just come off as you're complaining. You know what I mean? Then you just kind of come off as like the guy who's not grateful for what they have. And I think that's where a lot of strength coaches in this industry, men and women alike, kind of get deterred from wanting to stand up for themselves, because then you're kind of viewed as soft, or you're viewed as not a grinder. You know what I mean? So it's got to be this responsibility of creating a change internally needs to be put on our higher ups, whether it's a head ball coach, whether it's the head strength coach, whether it's the athletic director, right? Or what about our governing bodies, Tim? What about NSCA? What about CSCCA? You know what I mean? Like, how come they're not standing up? And I think that's one thing that Flack kind of refers to in his article as well, is, how come these people aren't kind of coming to the table and saying like, you know what, things aren't fair. We're the governing bodies of these positions. We're the licensing body of these positions that people are stepping into. Why aren't we kind of trying to help the little man? I mean, yeah, it's a sticky situation. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of go about it and dissect it and break it down. And I'll get into that more here in a little bit. Tim, I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on some of that, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the other things that you were talking about in regards to wage gaps and things like that amongst our higher ups and the little man.
Yeah, no, man, I got a super highway of notes, stuff you put down there that I literally going to touch on. And so to kind of move forward, and actually let me work backwards really quick. And I completely agree. And you brought up the example of, if you were allotted a certain amount of money, let's say for staff and being able to pay staff, and again, all strength coaches understand this is probably universal in many different professions about the political nature of being in the field. And so again, it's all about networking. We all know this, and this is why most of us, if not all of us, make the sacrifices up front to work for free and to do all these, let's say, crazy things that don't may be counterintuitive to just logical rationale, is so that you can get a good word put on your name, and it can open up so basically the upfront sacrifices kind of create for planting seeds that can turn into some professional harvesting later on. And so and I guess my point is that, let's say if a union was created and we did secure higher wages, how does that affect? And again, and he actually brings up, and I'll talk about this later, but he actually brings up like the NFL's Players Association. And so how much have, they been a benefit to, players, veterans who are already, and have done, spent their time and collecting that experience in the league, and how much has it really affected the rookies who are coming in and trying to get their feet wet, and also trying to get security as much as they can and create a situation that's not, again, so hell-bent, and wouldn't say destructive, but I'll say that how much of the benefit has went to the veterans in this case for strength and conditioning, how many of the benefits to the union would go to those who have already kind of put their time into, and then what would be the trade-offs for the interns and the newbies, the novices, the new coaches trying to come into the field, because kind of what history shows is that when that wage gets increasing, or when the wage let's say reaches a new level, that it prices out those inexperienced and I won't say unskilled, but those inexperienced workers. And I think skills and experience are basically synonymous with each other. And so, in my opinion, it would create, and historically speaking, it would create less opportunities for a Tim Smith to break into the field, and for yourself as well to break into the field, because no one would, for sure, no one would be willing to pay you anything, because they would have to, at a minimum, pay you. Let's say it went up to $20 an hour. They're not going to pay an intern $20 an hour. They're just not going to do it. And so if they were, then it may be a part-time position. It may be, hey, you can only show up for 10 hours a week because we just can't have you on the clock, longer than that. And so, in my opinion, it would create some type of disparities for the incoming group of coaches who truly, want to get in the field, and who truly need to get in the field and be around coaches who have obviously have networks and can put that good word in for them, and could create, let's say, some of that trajectory that they see once we take these internships and we kill them, and we do very well at them. So that's one aspect I wanted to touch on there. And let me pull up my slide really quick. And so moving forward with mine, and so you brought up the governing bodies, and so to try to understand this field saturation, and we already kind of talked about that, just the nature of strength and conditioning and having a certification process, that basically people, anybody, it's fair game for who could get these jobs. And so I kind of showed that, well, while the barrier of entry as far as what type of education you need, as far as the certification goes, what keeps those from really getting these positions is the political nature of it. So, hey, if I don't know you, it's just no shot you're going to get this. If you don't know anybody in the field, the chances that you'll actually get a job or even get an interview, it's slim to none. It's just not happening. In that case, so a lot of these jobs are on referrals for the most part. And so that kind of really self-governs itself and kind of keeps those on the outside, really on the outside, because you just won't get it without a reference in that case. And so I wanted to show that, if the wages are flattening, and if it is caused to an oversaturation of, let's say, people who are now able to get these jobs, creating more competition, and competition in the sense that, hey, they're willing to take less money. So in this case, hey, I'll take the person who will take less money in all cases. And so I look at the CS pass rates, or their exam statistics. They don't have it set out comprehensively like the CSCCA does. But since the rule in 2015 was passed, where at the Division I level that all strength coaches had to have an accredited certification, the pass rates have went up with the CSCS. So it went from 55% in 2016, so a year after the rule was instituted, up to 63%. And so I'm not sure if this actually plays a part, and this is on the first attempt as well, but I'm not sure if this is actually creating more coaches who are now battling for the same spots, because we do know university jobs, just at the Division I level for sure, aren't just opening up, in the sense that new jobs are creating, so staffs are expanding. So for instance, let's say, is the University of Washington expanding their strength and conditioning staff from 5 to 10, over a 20-year period? No, they pretty much are fixed. And so there's always a scarcity of those positions. There's always going to be more coaches oversupplied anyway. So I think the innate nature of it is, it's always going to be more coaches than jobs available at the Division I level. And we can continue to talk about at all levels, but we can go forward from there. And so he also brings up a point about, in this excerpt that I have, that a colleague told me that the same job he did for one organization 20 years ago now pays 50% less more. And he was accounting for inflation. And he also talked about himself as well, that in 2010, he knows multiple coaches who had, 2 degrees, and who had, copious amounts of student debt looming over their head, were only making $15,000 a year at the Division I level. And I'll talk about that a little bit more going forward as well, as my slide shifts over. And so then I wanted to use the CSCCA and what their pass fail rates have been to try to create. And actually, what I'll say about the CSCCA really quick is that they only initiate or institute one test per year, with the maximum capacity for the amount of people that can take the test at 200 individuals. So they're only passing a max of 200 people per year anyway. So the effect that of their pass rate going up, which it has since 2015, the rule went from 52% in 2015, and it fluctuated before then, up to 68%. So basically the trend has went higher as well. They're passing more applicants as well. And so again, is it just, coincidence that these pass rates have went up since the institution of this? Hey, maybe they want more individuals in those positions with the CSCCA, or the same thing with the NSCA. Do they want more people holding CSCSs or their credential going into these jobs as well? Because again, for licensing purposes. But again, I just wanted to create that context there. And then also moving forward, looking at the statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Labor statistics. So strength and conditioning is classified within coaches and scouts. And so, and again, I don't know what the actual percent for strength and conditioning is as relation to the employment change or the increase in jobs within the sports market of 34,300. But for the most part, it's saying that our field is growing in a positive direction that's higher than the average, industry or average field of choice at about 12%. So it's growing rapidly, and more jobs are being created as well. And so, again, it's just trying to create the narrative that, is this field saturation really an issue? And if jobs are pretty much fixed, let's say at the Division I level, what about opportunities? And again, if it's a discussion about the Division I level, then that's a whole different story. That, of course, it's always going to be scarcity. It's always, and that's like the first rule of economics anyway. There'll never be enough supply to meet the demand. So in this case, there'll never be enough Division I Power 5 jobs to supply the demand of people who actually want to fit those needs or fit those jobs. In that case. And so moving forward, I wanted to show this next slide that basically about the pay gap and, let's say, the wages flattening for strength and conditioning. And so the only thing I wanted to highlight here was that in 2013, let's say the average annual salary was $37,000, but this is highly dependent on geographical location that Coach Edelman actually alluded to, that it's different. And so they use the example of the District of Columbia in Pennsylvania. And also what's dependent on determining salary is the level upon which you work at. So are you a mid-major D1? Are we talking about Power 5 D1s? Are we talking about a mid-major in, let's say, California versus a Power 5, as he kind of discussed, in Texas, or a Power 5 in South Carolina, et cetera. And so he pulled the same statistics from the labor, U.S. Bureau of Labor, and showed that from 2010 to 2020, there was an expected 29% of increase in jobs available, which is a 14% rate that's higher than the national average there. So again, based on what this is saying, is that there are other variables determining what the pay gap is. And again, it's a very black and white or a one size fits all approach, not necessarily, because it determines, are you with a revenue sport? Are you with an Olympic sport? Again, where location are you? What level are you coaching at? And then I'll continue to get on the skills, the knowledge and abilities that shape this as well. And so on this next slide, what I wanted to get at, and this actually points to what I just said. And so we use the example that I've mentioned already, that 221-to-1 ratio between the top, and we'll say this is for, let's say, the athletic director, and I won't say the athletic director salary is 221-to-1. I won't say that, but it could be. But what I went and pulled was, and I'll actually show this after I pass it and get back to myself after I let Coach Edelman kind of speak on what I said, is that I looked at, if we account for entering a position first year, same thing, and we compare an AD in their first year of their position and a first year strength coach, I wanted to see what the discrepancy was. And in my opinion, we're evaluating apples to oranges anyway, because if you think about an athletic director, this may be their first year as an athletic director, but they come in with experience either teaching or coaching. And so their median income is 50,000 and 0.5, so 50.5, so basically 50,000. And for first year strength coaches, the median was about 38,000. And so what we do know about a lot of strength coaches, and again, and it didn't necessarily classify, actually I'll say full-time positions their first year, for a full-time position. How much experience is coming in, and secondly, what is the age between the two? And I'll show that later on as well, because that's going to dictate the difference in pay between the AD and the strength coach, because the AD on average is older when they enter those positions. They're in their 40s, normally in their 30s and 40s. And for the most part, most of them are in their 40s when they hit these positions. And strength and conditioning coaches tend to be 20 to 30 years old when they hit. So you talk about, let's say at the low end for a strength and conditioning coach, you're 20 years old versus a first year athletic director who's 40. They have 20 years of working experience, and it may be experience specifically in let's say sport, than a strength coach coming in, let's say at the same point in time in experience. And so that creates, and again, the gap is only $12,000 from a median standpoint, but that could actually speak to the difference in income between, let's say, people at the top of the athletic department and strength coaches when you weigh their age, skill sets, experience, work time, working consecutively. So turnover is another key part here. And so I'm just creating context around, again, I'm not defending the position, but I'm creating context that is there more to this than we're actually not accounting for to kind of move forward. And so I'll actually switch it back over and let Coach Edelman kind of respond based on what I said and move from there. What you think?
Tim, so let me ask you something. Would unionizing or having a strength conditioning, sport performance, again, whatever BS label you want to put on it, would it make it more competitive for people coming in? Like when we talk about saturation and things like that, would unionizing make the quality of employee higher? Can you give me your thoughts on that really quick? Because I'm from what I
yes.
understand,
So I would. Oh, you can go.
No. So I was going to say is from what I understand, it would. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So from what I've seen is that unionizing will hurt those entering the field more than it would do good. So the trade-off, so there's a trade-off here. And so as we kind of talked about, there's really no solutions, there's only trade-offs. So if we secure a labor union and get, let's say, a higher living wage or minimum wage, it will affect those coming into the field more. And so therefore it may actually drive unemployment in a negative direction, because if I have to now pay, let's say people who are already in the field, if I now have to pay you more, I'm now either going to shrivel up jobs because we're just not going to allocate more budget, let's say to the strength conditioning. In this case, you actually may see staff shrink, so that could be one negative effect. And secondly, it actually may price out, let's say, a second year strength coach. If they're like, hey, we're just not going to pay you, what this new minimum wage is, you're going to be out of a job. We're just not going to be able to do it. Then again, same thing there. You're going to price out newbies, and you're going to price out people who may not, again, have enough experience or the skill sets to justify this increase. And so it's the same thing that's seen like at McDonald's. If McDonald's raised their minimum wage, or if the minimum wage weighs, basis of what we're talking about now, if the minimum wage was increased, then it would price out a lot of those high schoolers that they hire. It would price out people who don't have, let's say, college degrees, etc. They wouldn't be able to, work at McDonald's, because McDonald's would have to, cut the amount of money they're spending on salaries, because they have to make the difference up by somewhere. And 9 times out of 10, it'll be by cutting jobs in that case. And so I think this would be the same case with the labor union. It would end up cutting jobs and then pricing those out who want to get in, and because there will be no free opportunities there.
So in order to make yourself, if there was a union, a strength conditioning union for whatever reason, in order to make yourself a more viable candidate coming in, that would just mean more experience, like maybe in your undergrad, and that would mean having your CSCS and your CSCCA and your FMS level 1 and so would it make it so the licensing and certification and experience would need to be, kind of there in order for you to enter? Does that make sense? In order to make you like a more viable candidate for a paid position right away?
Yeah, and so, well, the governing bodies would have to change the way they implement, because currently, let's say for the CSCS, you can't get the certification until you graduate. In the CSCCA, you can't get the certification until you have 640 hours of interning under an approved CSCCA coach.
Right.
So while it does add more rigor, in my opinion, to the certification by, hey, you have to have this amount of education before you can even be qualified or up or a candidate for the certification. But in my opinion, it works the opposite, because you won't be able to intern in college at a university where the rule is you have to have this certification. So the point being is, and I actually kind of go with this as well, is that in the long run, the certifications or the licensure really only affects positively the governing bodies, because
Right.
now it becomes the gold standard. You have to have this in order. So they have secured, consumer base,
Yeah.
basically, going forward, because it's a mandatory rule now. And so this is kind of what I was talking about, how rules and regulations and policies, they look and they sound good symbolically, but in the real world, they actually have the opposite effect. Because at this point, which has been, as you kind of know, some of the basis of what my research has been in my PhD and my master's program, is that what is the best way to try to create and get more experience while you're in school, trying to hit two birds with one stone. So when you come out, you've already had work experience, versus, hey, I graduate, now I have to start this process of working for free, etc. But the way that the rules and the certifications are set up, especially at the D1 level, that's just not possible, because in college, you wouldn't be able to have the prerequisites to get the certification. And so it hurts your mobility and what you can do while you're in school, trying to do both, trying to get work experience in the college sector. And I bring this up too, because if you look at a lot of the job descriptions, what do they ask for in experience? They don't ask for, hey, you have 2 years of experience coaching people in general. They say 2 years of experience, or X amount of years of experience in a collegiate environment. You have to have worked a job similar to this at the same, not the same level, but you would have had to work in a college environment, and that's impossible. If the standard is, or if the rule is, you have to have the certification to do it, because at that point it'd be malpractice. And I'm gonna say malpractice, but and it also would trickle down. Now, it's not a mandatory rule. I haven't seen it, but it's not a mandatory rule at, say, the JUCO, NAIA, Division 1, Division 2, Division 3. But just because they don't have the rule doesn't mean they're going to be biased towards the certifications. They may say, hey, we would like for you to have this cert. And what if you don't have it? Does that actually lower your chances of getting that job? Probably so.
Right. Well, okay. So, I mean, it's the system. The system would not allow and benefit a true union, is kind of what, like, I was getting at earlier. And I just needed you to kind of like help me along with that thought a little bit. You know what I mean? That's kind of like what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
That unionizing could potentially hurt more, or there's more, there's less benefits. It's less beneficial than one might think. Again, man, I don't think it's an external issue. I think it's an internal issue. And I think, I think like Flat mentions in his article, I think there are schools that take advantage and abuse the young entry-level workers that are coming in trying to make a name for themselves, because they know that they can exploit them a little bit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so, like, kind of, as you kind of talk about the system, let's say, being flawed, or it already has this exploitation kind of built into it, because you couldn't exploit, let's say, the intern if the intern was able to get the experience in college. Because so what I would say is, in like a economist, Thomas Sowell would say, and he's talking about, like the 1930s, and he his first job as a 16-year-old was basically, delivering telegrams. So he was working at Western Union, and he was getting paid, I think, like, in that times, it was like 1 cent an hour or something like that, because there was no minimum wage, and so he could get paid anything. But he said that now that I kind of look back on it in hindsight, he was like, I'm surprised that I was getting that, because I'm surprised that my boss, me take a step back. So he thought that, he was like, yeah, man, basically my boss, was really on me. He thought his boss was, kind of pushy. And so he said that, well, now that I kind of look back on that, he was like, I'm surprised he was able to put up with my incompetence. Because there's no way he would pay me more for my skill sets, because I had to learn on the job. And so I did a lot of dumb things. And he just would not have, if he had to pay me a minimum amount of money, I wouldn't have had a job from that case. And so, and again, I'm using a 16-year-old, but I'm just trying to create the picture here. Right. Is that because let's say you're pricing out, let's say these individuals, if we did start a union and get that minimum wage, interns without a shadow of a doubt would have to work for free in order to get in the field. It wouldn't even be, discussion of, all right, is there a way that we can create? If it's a minimum, they for sure wouldn't be able to get anything secured. So I don't care if it's 10,000 or a small stipend or whatever it is, that wouldn't be possible. And so a lot of the benefits historically that come from unions tends to be socially based. So in this case, that, it doesn't actually really have a huge amount of positive economic, practical, positive, effects on the actual labor union. It tends to be more social in nature. And a lot of the negative effects do happen economically and financially, in the sense of less jobs, higher unemployment, and does it really drive any economic growth within that actual industry? And it tends to be no, from international, just again, economic history internationally, in other countries such as, again, Asia and England and London, and also we can see it in Venezuela, right now, with the communist economy they have running currently. And so this is just what we've seen, or just what's happened. And I think that, again, it would price those individuals out.
And there's no way, I'm thinking about it too, as you're saying that, like, there's no way that you could really, internally speaking, right? If you did try and make the wage gap closer between the highest, let's say your head ball coach, and an entry level position, which, like you said, couldn't really even be an intern, right? So let's just say it's your lowest full-time person, and then you lower the salary of the head coach to appease and kind of make better the benefits and position for the lower level positions. Then you're going to have coaches that don't want to play at that school because they can make more at another school. It's just like, it's all over the place, man. You know what I mean? And it's just tough, because I think something needs to happen internally, but it somehow needs to happen internally. Like, we just need to decide as administrators at these high level universities, professional teams, that there needs to be less funds kind of allocated to the head coach and kind of more distributed to the others,
Yeah. And actually, I'll talk about that. Actually, let me pull it up and go. But so, yeah, I not proposed, but I was kind of alluding that, was he suggesting that there should be a salary cap? Let's say there's a salary cap on, what a head coach can make. And I kind of allude to this as well. And I kind of ask myself, why do we have, let's say, why before 2015? College sports were, clearly around before then, but why in 2015 was that rule, implemented?
Right.
And so you have to ask yourself the question, is that, and again, I don't know what the data or the statistics say, but if the rule was in there to protect the athletes, and when I mean protect the athletes and protect the university, I'm saying is that, do we think that if universities did not have this rule, that they would basically say, all right, we don't care about player safety, we don't care about finding qualified candidates, we'll just take anybody, we'll take Joe Doe, Joe Dirt off the street and make him our strength coach, because, hey, we don't have any rules and regulations that are dictating who we have to screen and what type of knowledge base. And I say this is because just because you have a certification, does that still save you from malpractice or, training that's not efficacious, training that, again, is not efficient, and again, does stuff that would not be of benefit to the athlete in the sense of preventing injuries and et cetera, because 9 times out of 10, where does a lot of that malpractice happen? If it does happen, it tends to come from the sport. It tends to come from the sport coaches. punishment runs and using things as punishment, that could lead to, let's say, malpractice, tends to come from the sport coaches. I mean, we've all been there, done that with, all right, come on, coach, you trying to run them in the ground, literally, like you literally trying to run them, into graves, etc. And so, the point, in my opinion, why hasn't there been stricter, if there were going to be rules in place, why hasn't there been stricter, more enforced rules on the type of qualifications and education that sport coaches have to have? Versus, we're going to make sure our strength coaches have this checkpoint, our athletic trainers got to have this, these certifications, their certification bodies, etc., have to be very rigorous, sports medicine, etc. But the only individual in this triad that appears to not be under the microscope and to not have to have some type of prerequisite of knowledge other than, a network popularity or some social aspect is the sport coaches. And they're the ones who obviously run the biggest risk in this case. And so that's kind of where I would go, with that, is that, if there were going to be something put in place, why hasn't it been put with the sport coaches, when a lot of these issues don't come from the support staff? A lot of this stuff doesn't come from the nutritionists and the sports site. All this nonsense that we talk about, that we see in the public, on media, et cetera. It tends to be the sport coaches. But who is the first one to always who's the first one that's always on the chopping block? In the media. University of Michigan just fired the strength coach. They're turning over the whole strength program. It wasn't, we all know it wasn't the strength coach. But normally normally strength coaches are the first line of firings. And it'll show you that, hey, the head coach, he must be under some pressure. So he's going to try to turn over his staff. And normally, hey, we get a new strength coach, it was our strength program, et cetera. No, that's not it. We know that's not it. It's nonsense.
They're the first ones to go in a lot of those cases because they're supposed to be responsible for like the culture and things like that. You know what I mean? They're supposed to be responsible for kind of the makeup and DNA and the grit of the group, and so, if you have a team that's not up to snuff, it's not winning games and stuff, a lot of the time you say like, because we're, our strength coach isn't getting us right mentally and physically, you know what I mean? So I think that's sometimes why they succumb to that wrath from your higher ups more often, you know what I mean? But
yeah, and I agree, because how much of that would change if a prerequisite, like in, let's say, the Soviet Union or the German Democratic Republic, to be a sport coach, you got to have your PhD. You have to have, you would have to have a PhD in that particular sport. So, if that was actually a criteria, you didn't even have to have a certification. But what if you had an education standard? Hey, in order to be a coach of, University of Washington, baseball, or University of Washington football, the head coach would have had to have, a PhD in pedagogy, in actually coaching. Let's say they had a PhD in coaching.
Yeah.
That would change. It would change the game, and you actually may save a lot of this. And the point being is, would you really pay that head coach? And actually, I say this too, because it's not, in my opinion, it's not. And it's interesting dynamics with economics just in general, because it's not necessarily, the sport coach is, has something about them, that makes, it's something about their skill set that makes them worth $40 million. It's not that. It's what universities are willing to pay for in order for the return in revenue that this coach may generate by, as you kind of talked about, wins and losses. If if Jim Harbaugh is going to increase our ticket sales, he's definitely worth $40 million if we want to pay him $40 million, because that $40 million is going to return us. If it returns us, let's say, a couple of billion, then it wasn't even a question on why we would sign him and bring him on for whatever reason. And so if we look at the return in investment on these high risk, big purchases, I mean, how much money or how many dollars is a strength coach really turning into, if you have them on your tennis team? Is this strength coach going to make back their salary in the amount of revenue that tennis is going to generate? Because we know in 2020, when COVID hit, that a lot of these Olympic teams were up on the chopping blocks to be, basically their case is closed as far as operating as teams, because most of them are operating at deficits. And so, and these are stuff we'll talk about, in future podcasts, et cetera, but it just brings up a lot of discussions, and a lot of truth begins to be, released, or kind of surfaces to the top of the waters, Because again, what is that return in value? They're telling you what they value us at based on what they're willing to pay us. And they say, hey, I mean, to be honest, we're losing by having an extra staff member, but we do win in areas of recruiting. And how much of, hiring a strength coach for tennis is to really appease, let's say, the tennis coach to say, hey, we do care about tennis, we want to show you that we care by giving you a strength coach, but that strength coach is also going to have, 6 other teams as well. So, and the point being is how much of it is it really? Because if the universities didn't have to, in my opinion, they wouldn't even have, they'd have 2 strength coaches. Hey, one for football, one for basketball. And if baseball is a revenue sport, like let's say at Vanderbilt, then we have one for Vanderbilt. But in my opinion, those teams, as most of them do, they pay for their own guys.
Yeah. Like
at University of Washington before, Todd was there. They paid for their own, out of the basketball budget, they were paying for their strength guy. He wasn't paid by the strength and conditioning department, or like strength and conditioning was the Olympic sports department. He was paid by basketball. Same thing, when I was at Purdue and et cetera, is that a lot of these guys, they're not paid by the actual, they're paid by the teams. And I guarantee you, if it could go that route, that's what, if tennis had to pay out of their budget for a strength coach, they say, oh man, no, we can't afford to pay for a strength coach. We want to put that money elsewhere.
I hope not. I hope they would realize that we play an important role,
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I completely agree. And so, yeah, for me, like, if I kind of go in, so what I wanted to show here, like really quick, was just, again, what the average salary was, that the salary for strength coaches has went up based on years of experience. But we see that it's not a huge, it's not a huge income increase. Like you go from 39,000 from your first year, and we're talking about 20 plus years, you're only at 54K. It's like, hold on. Like, so you got to kind of question yourself, like, how valuable, why is the market not seeing the value that we see in ourselves? Is kind of where I'm getting at. And so the same thing to kind of go on, what type of benefits, that strength coaches are getting. He mentioned that, not getting benefits, et cetera. And so we still have 33%, who don't receive any benefit. Some get medical, dental, and vision, but we still have 1/3 of the people, I think it was like close to 7,000 entries on this website that are not getting dental. And obviously it could be higher once the numbers, all the numbers come in. It could go up or down. And so moving forward, same thing here is that we see that, based on the type of skills that an individual has, it creates, let's say differences in pay. So, 44,000, if you had some aspect of, you had some nutritional, ability, and I mean abilities, just you had a nutritional skill set. So maybe you hold a cert, or maybe you majored in there and you have your CSCS, et cetera. But basically we see just a change in pay based on skills. And we also see, we also see a change in skills based on, as I kind of said, with, the improvements in technology, our ability to quantify the human body, and data analysis tends to show an 18% increase in average salary. So, and I've kind of already alluded to that already, that the field is changing and moving more and more to research-based, data-based, and being able to model that data and statistics, or the sabermetrics, et cetera. And so the same thing here is, he talked about the 72-hour work weeks, or 72-hour, work weeks in season, off season. So again, I just wanted to paint the context that, is it hell to pay in season? For sure, when you're traveling full time. And I remember, and you can again jump in at any point, but I remember when I was at the University of Washington, and we always had this discussion about, should we really travel? Like, come on, how much do we really do on the road? And I'm not talking about for everyone else or their sports, et cetera. But I literally remember like it was yesterday. He was like, yeah, he said the only reason I want you to come is because it makes our team look like, man, we have, hella resources. We have a lot of resources. It makes our team look, domineering may not be the right word, but it makes our team look imposing, because when we walk off the bus and they see, all right, they see the athletes, they see we got our nutritionist here with us, they see we got our learning specialist, we got a strength coach, like we look deep, we rolling in deep. And so it wasn't that, hey, Tim can offer some value, to us by being able to, plan the guys, etc. It was more so from a look standpoint. And it's the same thing I've kind of alluded to already, is that, having a strength coach more of a recruiting or a marketing tactic than it actually is like, so, are you paying me, is half of what I'm being paid valued at, how I kind of create more presence of the team when we're public, etc.
Yeah.
And I would say, well, how much is that worth? I mean, clearly not much, because, it's not translating in the pay. But, it wasn't anything around like, hey, I want you to come because, you're going to have a routine. Our guys are going to be able to get, stuff done. We can coordinate, using the weight room as we did when I met you at Fresno, et cetera. Are we going to be able to get those things in place so our guys are healthy and people on schedule and we have pitchers on, particular, lifting schedules, et cetera? Or is it more so for a symbolic look? And again, how much value am I operating there? And 9 times out of 10, as you kind of alluded to, man, like, yeah, the value that we offer is obviously much higher intrinsically than what is seen by, the sport coaches and what they value that, because the athletes are the ones who really know the amount of value that we bring. And I've seen that, in my full 6 years, the amount of value that I've seen returned is how the athletes, acknowledge what that value really is. And dang, Tim, I wouldn't even be able to make it through the season if you wasn't, putting all them late nights in, in the weight room, trying to get me recovered and et cetera, and everything that you do. Like it wouldn't even have been possible. But how much you do the strength coach, not strength coaches, but do the sport coaches know that? No. Does administration know that? No. And I'm not saying all of them aren't doing stuff behind the scenes as well, but strength coaching is really, as much as you do on the clock, it's really how much as you do off the clock as well that doesn't get accounted for. And you can kind of, jump in and throw your 2 cents in on there as well.
No, I mean, just like you said, man, behind the scenes, and I think that's why the value can be kind of askew dependent on the organization and dependent on, the importance of it. Kind of like you said with your guy at UW, like, obviously you would be the one to kind of be able to adapt to certain situations. Like if something did happen in a warm up or something like that, and you had a player that needed to modify something, like really you'd be the only one equipped. You and, one of the athletic training staff would be the only one equipped to be able to kind of handle a modification through the warm up if somebody needed it. But like he said, ultimately you were there on the road with them a lot of the time. If they had recruits from out of state that were checking out the game, or if they had, whatever the case is, boosters at the game that were donating money and things like that from out of state. And they saw the strength coach there and they saw you warming up the guys and they saw, the value that the perceived value that the program had for you, then I mean, that's only going to benefit, And so, like you said, like, is it more symbolic or is it actually helpful? I think that could be argued every which way. We're going to kind of talk about that a little bit next week too, right?
No, we're going to talk about that, in depth with the study that we look at to see like, hey, are strength coaches being marginalized based on the findings of that Oklahoma State football study? And in my opinion, I think it shows that, are we being marginalized based on the type of value that, the industry or universities or even just the current paradigm, and that, hey, we focus all our money on recruiting and not putting into strength coaches because we try to recruit the best athletes. And we think that's what is the determining factor, not developing athletes through, programming and periodization and, things that strength and conditioning coaches are supposed to do, which is develop the athletes. And in this case, as they kind of, some people kind of say is like, are we really, are we glorified personal trainers to get guys, bigger, stronger, but are we really having the type of developmental impact if the notion is that strength coaches are there to develop, the athletes physically so that, when they go through, let's say, the motor learning aspects on the field, that those can be maximized? And I would say no, because how much collaborate? Again, I've tried to collaborate over and over and over again, with sport coaches that I've interacted with, and it just doesn't happen. Either they don't have time or they don't think it's possible, or for whatever reason, it's just, it's really impossible, just from my experience, to collaborate and try to make the, what we're doing in the weight room very seamless. They just want to come in the weight room and see, all right, are they sweating? Are they working hard? Is it organized? All right, bet, dap me up. And, we out here, we coaches out of there, so, it's really, that's really how it is. And, and obviously it's frustrating for sure, because, again, if my numbers are showing that we're improving in the weight room, but, let's say we were measuring something on the court. Let's say for tennis, we're measuring, all right, is the velocity of their backhand or is the velocity of their serves improving? And it's a no. Is it because there's some type of, I'll say there's not a true link in transfer of training between what we're doing in the gym and what we're doing on the field. And so, yeah, it's a lot of stuff we'll talk about next week when we talk about that. Not I don't want to, spill the beans,
Right.
off rip, but, that's some stuff we'll talk about for sure.
Yes, sir. Yeah, man. I mean, again, I think, overall, this is why we kind of chose this article as one of it, because it could go, I mean, you're for and against a lot of things. You see a lot of pros and cons in every which direction. And that's why it's a good discussion. And that's why it can be a meaningful discussion. And I think it should be talked about more, man. I think we need to get together as strength coaches and kind of hash out the nitty gritty details of everything a little bit. I think that would be hugely beneficial. And I know there's a lot of people in the industry from my network that would benefit from that. You know what I mean? And so, and would want to see us benefit from that. You know what I mean? So, yeah, man, I think overall, like, it's a tough discussion to have, but that's why we're having it.
Yeah, no, agree. And I'll go ahead and kind of wrap us up, and I'll literally just take us through. So basically in the last part of like my PowerPoint was really getting to what we kind of talked about without it. And so, he mentioned the unskilled auto worker. And so I was just talking about basically the nature of, how do you really develop a skill set by becoming, let's say, you work, a car mechanic. Well, you work on cars. And so it's no more specific than that. In the case of strength and conditioning, you have to coach athletes. And if you're not coaching athletes, you're not gaining experience there. So maybe that's why the wages are different, let's say, from an unskilled auto worker. And is unskilled meaning they've never worked on cars, or does unskilled worker mean they've never had a full-time job, but they've always worked on cars? And in my opinion, it's just a different ball game, and how much of that is, political as well. And then I also said that I would like to know, more about his example of him, having his master's and his bachelor's degree and 10 years experience, but making minimum wage at a university. I would also, like to know that as well. And so we already kind of talked about the minimum wage, to millionaire coaches, and just the cost of qualification. And there are some, tax write-off opportunities there if your university can't pay for your continuing education or you maintaining your certification. And then I talked about, the years of interning and graduate assistance, which is the typical route into getting a full-time job. And we talked about that a ton. We talked about the missing talent that, it's not being afforded to work in the workforce because of these barriers. And I said, and let's say if the industry didn't change, what are ways that, that can be financed, and I know a lot of people working part-time jobs, trying to pay for the certs or trying to pay for it to make, doing these internships realistic. And we'll talk about this in another podcast as well, about what infrastructural changes can we make to make, it more competitive, but more competitive top down in wages and for those entering the field, et cetera. And can everyone win in this aspects? And we talk about, again, is the labor union best? I look at unemployment rates that they've been plummeting or going down. They're almost approaching 4% as of 2018. So, more coaches have been employed over time. So we're not seeing this, reverse aspect where, hey, strength coaches aren't getting jobs. And that's not the case. And then I use again my example of numbers of years on the job between an athletic director and a strength coach, a head basketball coach and a strength coach, a head football coach and a strength coach, and a athletic trainer and a strength coach. And what you see here is kind of what I alluded to already. is that there's a tremendous amount of turnover in strength and conditioning in that first and second year. Strength coaches aren't staying in, it may seem like it's not, but see, the interesting thing is, and this is what I thought about when I first got into the field, and I was like, all right, what are the real chances that I would become a director of a university program? I said slim to none, because if I look at this chart, and this actually made me reflect, if I look at this chart here, and I see that for assistant strength coaches, the turnover is exceptionally high. We do know that the directors who tend to hold positions, they tend to stay in positions for multiple years. So you have to really be in a good time, good timing upon your arrival. And let's say that, SID is actually on their way out. They're retiring or they're taking another job somewhere else, et cetera. So I said, man, is it really realistic? No, you got to pay your dues and put a lot of time in. And so with athletic directors, you see that as it gets past 1 to 2 years, I mean, they're staying in jobs, the same job longer than strength coaches. So not a lot of turnover there. Same thing with head basketball coaches. If you go out to 11 years, they're staying longer than strength coaches. Same thing for head football. Same thing for athletic trainers. And if we look at the age breakdown to kind of talk about, is the income inequality because of age? Age is never really accounted for. Well, it's the same thing. Well, as I said before, most of your strength coaches are younger on average than your AD coming into their positions at the same time. Same thing for athletic trainers. Athletic trainers, after you get after, again, 30 years old, they outnumber strength coaches continually as you approach. And most of them are in their 40s, as it says, over 40%. And for ADs, I mean, it's almost 80%, or it's, right at 70%. And the only thing I wanted to show here was that there is a way to get income mobility. So being able to move, your pay increase through skills, education, or knowledge, skills, and abilities, and experience. Are you working at the same job consecutively? And also, are you staying in the field, based on the absolute number of years as you go? And then we also see that, what companies or what type of company size, and this could be revenue as well, are generally hiring, strength coaches. And again, 1,000 to 10,000 employees, they're pretty big companies. In this case, universities or schools, because strength coaches are highly concentrated in education. So that's the other thing as well, highly concentrated in education. We're not even talking about the youth market that's been untapped, because there's strength coaches that are needed at the youth market. So we can actually create more jobs. And again, we would talk about this later, but we can actually create more jobs by creating a greater need for strength coaches, or more awareness at the high school level, at the youth level, where strength coaches should be, if we're talking about movement competence and trying to create good habits early on. Because once you get an athlete, at the college level, yeah, you can play, injury management, but at that point, a lot of the things that have been set in place physiologically are, kind of what you got, and you can definitely change and improve. But I'm just saying is that, why not start at the grassroots level before it gets to you? And that problem, we'll talk about that a little later as well. And so what I wanted to create here with these 3 slides, and so I'm just having them on here, so when you view it, you can go back and read them if you like. It's basically that, again, all of the negative effects tend to outweigh the positive effects of labor, of creating a union, and it tends to drive unemployment. Again, he used the example of the steel industry, of the coal industry, and then he also uses the example, this is an article from Thomas Sowell, economist, and he also used the Employee Free Choice Act, and just a lot of the negative aspects that come from unionizing. As I kind of say, unemployment rises. Yeah, you get the increase in minimum wage, but again, as he kind of alludes to, there's no free lunch here. You're going to lose. You're going to pay for it in some way, and the market will react and adjust. And how much, as we kind of saw as well, is going to be dictated that, hey, if strength coaches are demanding, this pay increase, well, what if we just get one of our ATs or one of our assistant basketball coaches or assistant baseball coach to get the CSCS? Now we got the strength coach and the assistant coach. Hey, that's more efficient. So I'm saying is, just like the oil, the coal, don't plant ideas, into the industry to find ways to become more efficient, because again, it will price you out of a job. And so going forward, again, same thing. We talked about the 60-hour work week. And again, are a lot of the things that we're alluding to, are they justified based on, again, experience, skills, knowledge, and abilities in education? Because if they are, then we definitely have an argument for why we're not getting paid equally based on what the market is dictating, based on our knowledge, skills, and abilities, where the market is moving. And so same thing, should there be a salary cap for head coaches? No, you probably should just put a hard cap on what type of skills they need or what type of education they need, so you can stop this malpractice, and then we can potentially bridge the gap there in that case. But again, in my opinion, because head coaches can dictate revenue, I mean, they're just going to be worth more in the sense of how much money they're getting. And in my opinion, if a university, as he kind of Flat alludes to, is that, I mean, hey, if the revenue of the company is improving, then everyone's pay should go up, Kama Sutra to that revenue. So, if we're paying you 10, it's just say if 10% of the revenue was going to salaries, and now let's say the university is making 100 million, and the next year they make 200 million, then 10% of 200 million is more money. So therefore everyone should make more money. But that tends to not happen. What happens is you have a fixed price, and when it gets to 200 million, now the amount of money you're paying the salaries is 5% instead of raising and staying at 10%. That would probably solve a lot of the issues if everyone got paid based on how much money was being made. On really good seasons, maybe you get more money. On seasons that aren't so great, or there's a hit, then again, you don't go drop below what your minimum salary is. But it only improves, but it doesn't decrease just because. But again, maybe that's asking for too much as you're going forward. Yeah. And only have a few more. And so same thing here, again, a lot of the justifications. And like I said, this is more so that you have the slide and you can review it in isolation and read it and kind of go on, because a lot of stuff has already been said moving forward. And I use the NFL Players Association. I've already said that, between the discrepancy between what are the trade-offs? What are the benefits? Is it for the rookies? Rookies probably say, nah, man, it's hell to pay that I'm under contract for 5 years. And let's say Russell Wilson, who was vastly underpaid, and you can say, oh, what was his contribution? Okay, the defense was the reason why they made it, Legion of Boom, etc. But he was vastly underpaid until he got his second contract. And that's the name of the game for a lot of these, quarterbacks or top skill position guys who are stuck under their rookie deals, and they outplay those rookie deals early, but they're under team control. And that's exactly what, let's say the system or the owners would want. Yeah, I would love to have team control. And this is probably more the case for running backs who have, in this case, short shelf lives, but getting to that first long term or getting to that second contract, I mean, it's like make or break. Am I going to get there? Are they going to overuse me until they have to end up paying me, et cetera? So we look at that there. So in this case, to what benefit has it been? Less practice for veterans, et cetera, but that's less developmental time for these rookies who are competing, to try to get, a piece of that bread there. And so same thing, again, history just says no on labor unions and them being more detriment than good to a particular organization or to the union. And the last slide, this is another article. And I'm not sure if he pulled from this article, but very similar in its notion that strength coaches, the position that they're in, is in a place of, again, inequality, and, they're just getting a very small piece of the pie. And I ended again with a quote here that much of the social history of the Western world over the past 2 decades has involved replacing what worked with what sounded good. And labor unions tend to sound really good, but for the most part, they just haven't turned into tangible things for you. So do you have any closing statements, any closing words before we get out of here, Coach Autumn?
All I was gonna say is you better love this job. You better love what you, because otherwise you're gonna be like my guy Flat. You're gonna feel like you were wronged, and you are gonna feel like you need to unionize with all your boys in order to make things right. When in actuality, the system is rigged. It's messed up, and so you better love coaching athletes, and you better love being in that environment, because otherwise it's always going to seem unfair.
Yeah, man, I agree. You definitely got to have a love for what you do. And again, we'll talk about, we kind of alluded to already what we'll talk about on our next podcast. And the discussion will be around, are strength coaches marginalized based on a study that was conducted in 2013 with the Oklahoma State football program. And what they saw was that athletes were getting bigger and stronger, but they were not improving in speed characteristics. In this case, the 40-yard, basically they weren't sprinting faster, et cetera, but they were improving in other areas. And this creates the notion that, how much value are strength coaches really adding? And is this one reason why we are being marginalized. So I really appreciate you tuning into the Sports Performance Professional Podcast. We'll see you next time.
Appreciate y'all.